In the rough, smoke-thick air of turn-of-the-century Joplin, Missouri, the cries of ore carts, the clatter of horse hooves, and the whir of zinc and lead operations were more than the sounds of industry. They were the soundtrack of a city bursting with ambition and bristling with lawlessness. Joplin was built on wealth pulled from the ground, but that wealth came with costs. Poverty, vice, and violence grew in the shadow of progress. It was in this volatile atmosphere that a man named William Thompson Schmulbach would carve out a name both feared and whispered. Born in Kentucky in 1874, William was the son of John and Sarah Schmulbach. His early life was shaped by the hardships of a working-class family in rural America. By 1880, the family had moved to Beaucou in Perry County, Illinois, a farming community where large families and backbreaking labor were the norm. William grew up with 5 full siblings and 13 half-siblings. Details of his youth are sparse, but those who would later encounter him described a man built from tough stock, stout, of medium height, with steely blue eyes. His physical presence, according to his 1917 draft card, was as unyielding as his reputation would later become. By the early 1900s, William had settled in Joplin. The city's red light district thrived alongside its mines, and the streets teemed with opportunity for both honest work and underhanded dealings. In 1903, William married Ida Mitchell, yet Ida was not the only woman in his life. Around this time, he was also associated with another woman named Jessie, with whom he shared an address at 802 Main Street. Jessie operated a house of ill repute, a brothel, in the heart of Joplin. Whether William profited from or simply tolerated her business is not fully known, but his relationship with Jessie would soon draw him into a fatal encounter with the law. On the night of November 15, 1909, officers William Smith and Timothy Graney of the Joplin Police Department conducted a raid on Jessie's establishment. Along with Jessie, they arrested her employee, Maud Martin, for prostitution-related offenses. The officers began walking the 2 women through downtown Joplin toward the city jail. As they reached the intersection of 8th and Main Streets, they were confronted by William Schmulbach. What happened in the next few moments is the subject of disputed testimony, but the result was not. Words were exchanged. Witnesses said Schmulbach was furious about Jessie's arrest. In the middle of that heated exchange, Schmulbach drew his revolver and opened fire. Patrolman William Smith was hit and killed almost instantly. Officer Graney was shot in the knee and fell to the ground. In the ensuing chaos, Schmulbach fled the scene. The killing of a police officer in the center of a bustling mining town sparked a manhunt that stretched across state lines. While Jessie's charges were quietly dropped 2 months later, authorities launched an intensive search for her husband. For nearly 2 years, William remained a fugitive. He traveled through Oklahoma, New Mexico, and California, hiding in plain sight and eluding capture. Then, on September 1, 1911, law enforcement in Seattle, Washington, acting on a tip and aided by a wanted poster, arrested him without incident. He was extradited back to Missouri to stand trial. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, civic leaders, and residents of Joplin who remembered the night that Officer Smith died. Prosecutors charged Schmulbach with first-degree murder. They argued that he had ambushed the officers without justification and had shown no remorse. The defense, led by attorney George R. Clay, countered with a narrative of self-defense. Clay claimed that Officer Smith had approached Schmulbach with a gun drawn, and that William feared for his life. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder, and the court sentenced him to 30 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. But Clay appealed, arguing procedural errors and citing new testimony. In a surprising decision, the Missouri Supreme Court granted a retrial. That second trial concluded on January 26, 1913, with a full acquittal. The jury deliberated for 15 hours before returning a not guilty verdict, citing reasonable doubt over whether Officer Smith had drawn his weapon first. Free from the burden of a conviction, Schmulbach left Joplin. His notoriety had grown too great to allow him to resume a quiet life. He relocated to Picher, Oklahoma, a mining town that, in many ways, mirrored Joplin's early chaos. In the 1920s, Picher was a place governed as much by business interests as by any formal civic code. Law enforcement was weak, and violence was common. In this environment, Schmulbach found renewed purpose. He became a merchant policeman, a type of private security officer hired by local businesses to keep order in the streets and protect property. The position was unofficial but potent. It offered Schmulbach a badge of authority without oversight. He carried a revolver and patrolled the streets with impunity. He made arrests, issued warnings, and resolved disputes through fear or force. For a man like Schmulbach, who had already killed and escaped justice, the job allowed him to enforce the law on his terms. Over time, his presence became both a comfort and a threat. Some merchants saw him as necessary. Others whispered concerns. That tension exploded into deadly violence again in 1926. On June 10 of that year, two men, Lee Flournoy and Charles Mays, entered Picher. Both were wanted in Kansas for their alleged involvement in a series of bank robberies, including a recent heist in Cherryville. Local authorities received reports of their presence, and Schmulbach took action. The details of the encounter are murky, but what is certain is that Schmulbach confronted Flournoy and Mays, possibly with the Picher chief of police by his side. A shootout ensued. In the brief exchange of gunfire, both Flournoy and Mays were killed. Bullets tore through their bodies in the middle of a busy intersection. In the chaos, a stray shot also struck the chief of police in the leg. That bullet had come from Schmulbach's own revolver. Despite the accidental injury to a fellow officer, Schmulbach faced no charges. The deaths of Flournoy and Mays were quickly justified as necessary force. The chief's injury was dismissed as a tragic but understandable mistake. The press praised Schmulbach as a fearless enforcer who had eliminated dangerous fugitives. No grand jury was convened. No internal review was held. The bodies were buried, and the town moved on. The following year brought another deadly encounter. On the night of November 15, 1927, exactly 18 years after the Joplin shooting, Schmulbach killed again. His victim was a man named Hugh Harold. The incident occurred in a dark alleyway behind a residential area of Picher. Harold, who was reportedly carrying a large sum of money, was walking near the home of a relative when Schmulbach encountered him. Schmulbach claimed that Harold behaved suspiciously and refused to stop when ordered. Harold fled down the alley. Schmulbach opened fire. 4 bullets struck Harold in the back, one of them piercing a lung. Harold collapsed and died at the scene. He had not drawn a weapon. No contraband was found on his person. No charges had been pending against him. The shooting raised eyebrows, but not legal action. On November 22, Judge Davidson ruled that Schmulbach had acted in self-defense. The reasoning was that Harold's decision to flee indicated guilt or dangerous intent. The ruling did not account for the fact that all shots were fired from behind. No indictment followed. The death was marked as another instance of street justice in a town that had grown used to it. By now, William Schmulbach had killed 5 men. Each time, he had walked away. Each time, the legal system had either failed to act or had ruled in his favor. He had built a life on the edge of law enforcement, and the community had allowed him to do so. But the man who had outlasted judges, juries, and gunfights was nearing the end of his protected reign. The final act came on October 5, 1930, in broad daylight, on Main Street in Picher. Frank Carlock, a local druggist, was exiting his vehicle outside his pharmacy at 201 Main Street. He carried a .22 rifle, though it remained at his side and was never raised. Witnesses said he was preparing to enter his store when Schmulbach appeared. Without warning, Schmulbach drew his revolver and fired 4 times. 3 of the bullets struck Carlock in the back. He collapsed on the pavement, bleeding out in front of stunned pedestrians. The motive was quickly established. Carlock allegedly owed Schmulbach a debt of $1,000. Whatever financial dispute had passed between them was now settled through violence. This time, the public mood shifted. There were too many witnesses. The location was too visible. The circumstances too stark. Schmulbach was arrested at the scene and charged with murder. The trial that followed in Ottawa County would bring an end to the life he had lived for decades. Witnesses testified that Carlock never raised his weapon. The autopsy confirmed that all shots were fired from behind. The prosecution reminded the jury of Schmulbach's long record of violent confrontations. For the first time, his history was not a badge of honor but a record of unchecked aggression. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. Schmulbach was sentenced to life in prison. He entered the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, a man finally held to account. His reputation, once protected by silence and power, had been reduced to a prison number. The town of Picher, at last, had witnessed the fall of its most dangerous enforcer. In Part 2, we will explore what became of Schmulbach after his conviction, the unexpected events that led to his release, and the lasting imprint he left on the communities he haunted. His final decade, his quiet death, and the unresolved questions about power, law, and violence will come into focus as the story of William Schmulbach comes to its inevitable conclusion. William Thompson Schmulbach entered the gates of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1930 as one of the most notorious men in the state. For over 2 decades, his name had traveled on the breath of citizens in Joplin and Picher, carried in equal parts by fear, rumor, and fascination. He was a killer whose badge had shielded him, a peacekeeper whose brand of order often resulted in blood on the street. But after the cold-blooded murder of Frank Carlock in broad daylight, with multiple witnesses present and no justification that could stand against the evidence, even his notoriety could not protect him. The Oklahoma State Penitentiary, known among inmates and staff alike as Big Mac, was located in McAllister. It was a facility built to house the most dangerous criminals in the region, and it made no exceptions for men who had once been lawmen. Incarceration stripped William Schmulbach of the last vestiges of his power. Inside the gray stone walls, he was no longer the man with the gun who patrolled Picher's streets. He was just another prisoner, identified not by his deeds but by his number. Little survives in the public record about Schmulbach's day-to-day life during his imprisonment. He entered prison at 56 years old, a man already showing the wear of his turbulent past. The lack of recorded disciplinary actions or official incidents involving his name suggests that he kept a low profile. Perhaps it was age that subdued him, or perhaps the walls of the penitentiary finally made him realize the permanence of the consequences he had spent his life avoiding. What is certain is that he did not serve the life sentence handed down to him by the court. In 1936, just 6 years after his conviction, Schmulbach was granted a pardon. The reasons behind the decision remain unclear. In that era, clemency decisions were often made without public explanation. They could be influenced by political alliances, the recommendations of prison officials, or the claims of good behavior and declining health. In Schmulbach's case, the details were never revealed. What mattered was the outcome. He walked free. His return to Picher after the pardon was quiet. The town he came back to had changed. The mining boom that once drew thousands to the region was starting to wane. The streets were less crowded, the bars less rowdy, and the appetite for vigilante justice less pronounced. The community had borne witness to too many tragedies, and the confidence once placed in men like Schmulbach had eroded under the weight of their violence. Schmulbach did not resume his former role as a merchant policeman. Whether by personal choice or public pressure, he stepped away from his past identity. Instead, he took a position as a security guard for the Eagle Picher Company. It was a job that kept him connected to the mines and the infrastructure of the town, but without the public visibility or unchecked authority he once held. He worked quietly, without incident. There are no records of confrontations, no whispers of conflict. For the first time in decades, Schmulbach seemed to live a life free from violence. From 1936 to 1946, he aged into obscurity. The man who had once made headlines for killing police officers, robbery suspects, and alleged prowlers now went unnoticed by the town he once ruled. He lived out his days in the same place where he had committed his most unforgivable act. The same sidewalks where he had killed Frank Carlock now carried his aging footsteps as he walked to work or to the local shops. Those who remembered him kept their distance. Those who did not never knew to look. In 1946, William Schmulbach died. The specific cause of death is not preserved in public accounts, but he was 72 years old. His death, like his final years, passed quietly. No headlines announced it, no commemorations were held, there were no interviews with old colleagues, no reflections on his time as a lawman. The community had, in many ways, already buried his memory. For those who still lived in Picher and remembered his name, there was no mourning. There was only the dull finality of a story that had long since worn out its welcome. He was survived by his widow, whose name does not appear in the records surrounding his death. His sister, Anna Hoagland of Kansas City, and his half-brother, Clay Brown, a detective in Joplin, also outlived him. Funeral arrangements were handled by the Durnell Funeral Home. His burial location is not widely known, and no monument stands in his honor. Schmulbach's legacy is not measured in accolades or plaques. It is measured in the lives he took, the fear he cultivated, and the space he occupied in the gray area between justice and lawlessness. He represents a time in American history when towns like Joplin and Picher were forging themselves from the raw elements of ambition, labor, and conflict. These places grew faster than their institutions could manage, and in the vacuum that followed, men like Schmulbach emerged to fill the roles that formal authority could not. He was not unique in this regard. Across the early 20th century Midwest, many communities saw the rise of self-styled enforcers, men who claimed to keep order through strength and violence. But few wielded that role for as long or as lethally as William Schmulbach. He operated without meaningful oversight for more than 20 years, killing at least 5 men and injuring several others. Each time, he escaped consequence until the killing of Frank Carlock forced a reckoning that even he could not outrun. The communities he shaped, especially Picher, were left to reconcile with the memory of a man who once served as both their shield and their sword. For some, his presence brought a sense of safety, especially in the lawless days of the mining boom. For others, he was a reminder of how easily power can turn predatory when left unchecked. His ability to act with impunity for so long reflects not just his personal resolve, but the deep flaws within the systems that enabled him. The question of what Schmulbach reveals about his time is one that invites difficult reflection. He was a product of an era in which formal law enforcement was often outnumbered, undertrained, and underfunded. Communities placed their trust in individuals rather than institutions. In doing so, they allowed violence to become a substitute for order and intimidation to masquerade as justice. He was a man who lived in that space where the rules were made in the moment and often rewritten by the loudest voice or the fastest trigger. His badge was not issued by a police department but by the consensus of those who believed he could protect their interests. His revolver was not sanctioned by law but tolerated by silence. There is a temptation to view men like William Schmulbach as relics of a bygone era, products of frontier justice or the rugged individualism that shaped the American West. But to do so is to ignore the consequences of their actions and the people whose lives were ended or forever altered by their decisions. Hugh Harold was shot in the back. Frank Carlock was gunned down over a debt. Lee Flournoy and Charles Mays never stood trial. Patrolman William Smith died doing his job. These men were not legends. They were victims. Schmulbach's survival and eventual pardon highlight another truth: that justice is often vulnerable to the same power structures it seeks to control. He walked out of prison not because he was innocent, but because the system allowed it. He returned to the same streets where he had spilled blood and lived another decade under the same sky, among the same people, many of whom still bore the emotional scars of his actions. The story of William Schmulbach is not one of redemption. It is not a story of rehabilitation or forgiveness. It is a story of what happens when accountability is delayed for too long, and when fear is mistaken for respect. His life offers a lesson in what can be lost when communities allow violence to become a tool of governance. Today, little remains of Picher. Decades of mining left the town so contaminated with lead and zinc that it was eventually declared uninhabitable. The Environmental Protection Agency designated it a Superfund site, and by the early 21st century, most of its residents had been relocated. The streets where William Schmulbach once walked are empty now, the buildings abandoned, the ground unstable. Nature is slowly reclaiming the place he once ruled. There is a kind of symmetry in that. The town that enabled him is gone. The systems that failed to restrain him have dissolved. What remains is the record, preserved in court documents, newspaper archives, and the fading memories of those who lived through his time. That record is enough. It speaks not only to who he was, but to what he represented: a man who blurred the line between protector and predator, and a society that, for too long, refused to draw that line clearly. In the end, William Schmulbach was not defeated by an enemy, nor was he destroyed by scandal or rebellion. He lived long enough to see himself fade, and in that fading, his story became a warning. Power without accountability is not strength. It is danger, and when that danger wears the guise of authority, it is all the more deadly. His name is no longer spoken in fear, but it should still be remembered, not to honor what he did, but to remember what can happen when no one is willing to say enough.